right, well, thank you all. Welcome. Thanks for coming. This is Meher Baba of Ahmednagar and the Aesthetics of Religious Symbolism, a series of 10 biographical talks by Dr. James Newell. That's me. This is talk number 7, and it's really, we're already up to the new life, and there's only 3 talks left, and it's really, you know, with 10 talks, you would think that would be plenty, but it have to be very selective and pick certain things, and just I sometimes give other things short shrift, and I have to make decisions about that. And last time, with the videos and the talk, I was trying to cover a lot of material with Meher Baba's work with the musts, and because of that, there's a couple other things that happened in the 40s that I didn't get to, so I'm going to cover that today as well. So again, welcome. Up to this point, we've discussed several times our thesis for this project, this whole biographical narrative about Meher Baba's life, as well as our academic approach to the study of Meher Baba's life from the perspective of the history of religions. As I've said repeatedly, I'm primarily interested in focusing on the particular aesthetic of religious symbolism reflected in Meher Baba's life and the work, because that's, I think that's kind of something that generates a lot of energy when the symbolism itself attracts people in particular ways. So we've discussed so far, up to this point, we've gone through Meher Baba's family and early life, the family crisis that followed his apparently confused state of mind after his encounter with the Muslim holy woman Hazrat Babajan, and his subsequent encounters with other spiritual personalities of the time, Sai Baba, Tajuddin Baba, Upati Maharaj, and Narayan Maharaj of India. He experienced what many understood to be a recovery from this psychological crisis after an extended stay with Hindu master Upasni Maharaj, after which he immediately began functioning as a spiritual master himself. Now, I'm describing this from the history of religion, so the religious narrative wasn't that he had a confused state of mind, although the people in the community and even his own mother thought he had gone crazy. He thought that he was insane. His description, his self-report of this, was that he had had a spiritual experience of unity with God, not just unity, but identification with God. And he said that his time with Upasni Maharaj helped him to reintegrate that vision, which completely sort of erased what he calls illusion, the world in which we live, and through the work he did with Upasni, it helped him to reintegrate into the gross world. So, having already attracted numerous followers, he began a program of training his close devotees. This training consisted primarily in developing affectional bonds, teaching specifics of cosmology, of the spiritual path, and of obedience to the master. After this initial period of training, Meher Baba began developing a home base at what came to be called Mehrabad in Ahmednagar, Maharashtra state in India. At Mehrabad, Meher Baba began working with a variety of groups of people, establishing schools and contacting hundreds of people on a weekly basis, sometimes thousands when they had a big celebration, birthdays and what have you. In 1925, he began observing silence, that is, abstaining from verbal speech, and communicated first by writing on chalk slates, and then later by pointing to printed letters on a wooden board. It's an example of that there. It's the board he used when he arrived in the United States. In 1930, he made his first visit to the West, Europe, and the USA, and despite the sensationalism in the press and some accompanying controversies, he continued to attract followers there, some of whom traveled to India in order to stay with him. In our last talk, we discussed a particularly interesting development in Meher Baba's work, which is his work with those whom he described as musts, or God-intoxicated people. Now, you'll notice that I've emphasized in this sort of recap excuse me, a list of aspects of Meher Baba's life that are particularly resonant with symbolic interest. Each of these, his unusual experiences with spiritual figures, his development of his own ministry, his training program, observing silence, traveling to the West to the accompaniment of sensational press coverage, and his fascinating work with the God Intoxicated. All of these have both a concrete, factual aspect as well as a resonant symbolic aspect. Of all of these, symbolic, what I'm calling symbolic factors in his life, of all these, one of the most interesting and symbolic phases of his life is what we will be considering today, what Meher Baba called his new life, or called the new life. Now, before I go to that, as I said, there's some things that I might have talked about last time, and because it was covering the period of the 40s, because I'm trying to go thematically, I did not cover these two events, which they actually play into the narrative that continues from here, so I want to talk about some of that. But before we get into the new life and life phases of his work, and these again are focusing on them because they're very symbolic, and there's a lot of description and sort of almost poetic description of what he's doing in his life and what the developments are that he's acting out. And I'm going to get into that in his own words, but before I do that, there's two important events that occurred during the 40s. These are the development of the Meher Spiritual Center, which is across the street, and Meher Baba's first contacts with the movement that has come to be known as Sufism Reoriented. So, while in India in May of 1941, Meher Baba gave instructions to two of his disciples who had began following him as a result of his first trip to the West in 1930, Norina Machabelli and Elizabeth Patterson, and he gave them instructions to find property for establishing a center in America. On June 4th, 1944, Elizabeth Patterson, after having spent several years searching, wrote a long letter to Meher Baba describing the tract of land in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, that had been given to her by her father. There's a long, lovely narrative which she pretty much fills out. It's the main narrative that we have of that whole process, which she wrote to Meher Baba and described how she had looked everywhere except this place, which was kind of a pet place, this Myrtle Beach itself. Before it was developed as a pet place of her father's, she called it, and perhaps because of that she was resistant to that, looked in California, looked everywhere, and then eventually came here, and there were certain conditions that Meher Baba gave her, that it had to be near, had to have fresh water, had to be near the ocean, had to be a temperate climate, and it had to be given with love. And it filled all those things, and her father just gave her as a gift this big chunk of, it's actually 800 acres that he gave her. Started out though, he initially almost, let me see, what would this make it? Was that 74 years ago in 2 weeks? It'll be the anniversary. But so in this letter, anyways, he sent them to establish the center, and in this letter she explains that the 500 acres of the property, the first 500, which is what now is the center, the other parts had to ultimately be sold off because a foreign national could not own more than 500 acres in his own name.
They couldn't even own 500, only up to 500.
Up to 500, okay.
So we said in the mall is the other part of the other.
Yeah, the mall and Briarwood, we've been told. Is that, yeah. So I like to think it's Briarwood because we live in Briarwood.
I heard it is, actually.
Yeah, I think it certainly looks very much, it's like having a big cabin on the center. It's very nice. So in this letter she explains that it was deeded to her in her name on May 15th, and this letter was sent in June. So she waited. They'd been cabling back and forth, but she waited to tell him that it was a done deal until she had it in her name. So in 1952, soon after he completed what he called his new life, which we'll be talking about shortly, Meher Baba visited the center established in his name for the first time. But during the intervening years, another important development occurred that I want to touch on as well before we get into all the details of the new life. So in the early 1920s, the Sufi master Hazrat Inayat Khan founded a Sufi order in the West based upon his own Chishti order Sufi teachings. Upon his death, an American disciple named Rabia Martin became the Murshida of Sufism in the United States. Robbie Martin learned of Meher Baba through Norina Machiavelli and Elizabeth Patterson, and after a period of soul-searching and study, she decided to dedicate both herself and the Sufi order to Meher Baba. And she felt that she didn't have the wherewithal to really be a spiritual master, and she was trying to find some, almost silently looking for someone to take over this huge responsibility or help to guide her in this huge responsibility. She had Inayat Khan, who by all reports was a very, very powerful and influential and real spiritual master.
Can I add one element here because it's very important?
Yeah.
She was not floundering around looking for a spiritual master. Hazrat Inayat Khan had told her when he had spent about 6 weeks with her alone that she was his choice to succeed him. And the duty of a murshid was not only to guide the murids, but to find the kutub of the age, or the Rasul if he's in the world. And Inayat Khan told her that the Rasul was either in the world or about to appear, and she should look all over to try to locate him. That's why she was looking.
I did not know that.
Makes a big difference.
That is, yeah. Well, I knew that she was looking. I didn't realize the motivation. So she was looking. She found Meher Baba, and this was a good choice on her part, I think. So before her death in August of 1947, Rabia Martin appointed one of her murids, Ivy Deuce, as her successor, and encouraged Mrs. Deuce to contact Meher Baba and ask for his help in directing the future of the order. In January of 1948, Mrs. Deuce traveled to India with her daughter Charmian and met Meher Baba and his Mandali for the first time. Eventually, under Meher Baba's direction, she created Sufism Reoriented, a Sufi order that she intended to be entirely dedicated to Meher Baba and reoriented towards following his teachings. So these factors will, particularly next time, will figure in, the center figures in quite a lot in what I want to talk about today, because there's really a connection, I think, between all the events that happen after this new life. This new life phase is really quite remarkable in a number of ways, and I'm not going to, it's not really possible to go into extraordinary detail with this because it's, I mean, as we'll say later, I could easily do 10 weeks of 2-hour talks and not cover all the things of interest in the new life. But suffice to say for now that on October 16th, 1949, Meher Baba set out on one of the most remarkable phases of an already remarkable life. He called this phase the new life, and it amounted to a combination of what appeared to be both an ascetic exercise, because it rigorous disciplines, and although relatively simple rules, put in practice, they're very, very difficult rules to follow. Like while you're walking for miles and miles and hardly having anything to eat and not knowing where you're going to sleep, and maybe it's raining, you're supposed to be cheerful all the time. That's just, and on, little things like that. No arguments between the people, and there's just what you would think were pretty simple things, but then they really become very intense. But to a person, anyone that I've spoken to who was in this period, the new life, they said as long as they were with Meher Baba, they really didn't care. They would rather, Adi K. Rani years later used to say, I would rather be in hell with Meher Baba than in heaven without him. And that's how people seem to feel during the new life. They said they wanted, his personality was such, and his, I had mentioned earlier in his training, the key, from my observation, the key to all of his training was first establishing affectional bonds. And once the bond was set, once the attachment was there, the loving attachment, people would do pretty much anything for Meher Baba. So at this time, internationally, World War II was just over. Many people around the world were attempting to return to a state of relative normalcy. In India, the Great Partition of 1947, which had divided the subcontinent into two separate states, India and Pakistan, and had disrupted lives throughout these two countries, which were now separated essentially along religious lines. Of course, the Hindus in the main body of India, and then wherever there's a majority of Muslims, they agreed through long hours of wrangling that would be a new Muslim state of Pakistan, and where there's a Hindu majority, because if they're trying to put together a a democracy, it becomes very one-sided when there's a huge population of Hindus. The Muslims would always be in the minority. So they eventually did that. However, the initial problem, aside from the partition itself, was that the Muslim majority was on the west side and also on the northeast side. And the northeast side eventually became Bangladesh, but they were originally both Pakistan. So all of this, and there was, Adi Kirani used to say, I don't know anything about this except what he said, but he said that more people died during the partition of India than in the entire Second World War. No, I don't know if he means the battle, or if he's also counting the Holocaust and all that, I don't know. But very, very bloody and terrible experience for people to have to move. The Hindu population wanted to move to the center of India where the Hindu population was, and Muslims who were in that area wanted to move to Pakistan. So there was all this, and there was some rancor going along with that. So it became riots and bloody and all that. So at this historical moment, and with little explanation at all, Meher Baba decided to give up all of his worldly belongings and depart on a life of walking, begging, and renunciation. In terms of possessions, he retained only a few personal items for travel and 2 properties in his name. Most of the things you'll read, even in the Balkocuri's book on the New Life, it says the only property he kept in his name was the Samadhi, his tomb shrine, what was to be his tomb shrine, on Mehrabad Hill. However, truth be told, this property in Myrtle Beach was also in his name.
That's right.
He kept both in his name during that period. But other than that, he had a lot of people dependent on him. Elaborate arrangements were made to care for disciples who Meher Baba had been supporting, and meetings were held to determine who would go with him and who would stay behind. Documents were signed indicating each one's commitment and expectations, and it was quite an event. Now, he said not only was he going to go away, but there were all these restrictions on people. If they didn't come with him, first of all, if he came with him, he had to follow these very, very tight, rigorous rules, and cheerful all the time, and etc. And if you stayed behind, you were never to see him again. Literally, you were never to see him again. Now, at this time, someone who many of us knew when he was living, this is a man, Darwin Shaw, who lived in New York, but he came down to help Elizabeth Patterson prepare the Meher Center, and one of his main jobs was to drain the swamps so there'd be fewer mosquitoes. There's a lot of swampy, watery areas there. And while he's doing that, he's sending cables back and forth to India, asking Meher Baba, what about this, what about that, and doing some of these things for Elizabeth Patterson. And he's getting cables from Meher Baba saying, you have to do this and that, I want everything to be ready when I come. He's also getting cables about the New Life saying, you're never going to see me again, you have to be resigned to the fact that you're never going to see me again. And he said that he felt that Baba wanted him to keep both of these ideas in his mind at the same time. And there weren't that many people in that position, but there were. But particularly if you were in India, you were to resign yourself to never seeing him again. You weren't supposed to seek him out. If you heard that he was somewhere, you were supposed to, the stories of Merwan Jesawala, Arish Jesawala's brother, would tell that he was in Pune one day doing the marketing. He would do the marketing every morning for his family. Meher Baba had specifically said, I need Arish with me, but if someone has to be here to look after the family, will you, because he wanted to go on the New Life too. He asked him, he accepted him into the New Life, but then he asked him, please, you'll be doing your best service by staying with the family. So he did. He's going out doing the marketing in the morning, and there he sees Arish and Meher Baba together doing something. He has to turn his face and run in the other direction because he doesn't want to break the order to not see him. So there was all these elaborate things going on to set this up. He was going to be gone. People couldn't give him. There was a period when they could give him money, and then nothing else. And the stories that come out of all this are fascinating and can go on really for forever. So I won't go into really any of those, but we will. We'll talk around it, and we'll try to get kind of a bird's eye view rather than there are many touching stories of how Mayor Baba helped people during this, how people were attracted to him, how almost magically food and sustenance and things would appear. They'd beg for people who had nothing, and they would go out of their way to get food for them. So, as I said, there is much that one could say about Mayor Baba's New Life wanderings. No doubt a series of 10 talks on Mayor Baba's New Life would not adequately cover the interesting stories that have emerged, the remarkable disciplines and ascetic achievements endured, and the miles traveled, etc. So, I'm not going to attempt such an arduous feat, but if you'd like to research some of the many fascinating details on Mayor Baba's New Life, I would refer you to Bao Kalturi's book, Mayor Baba's New Life, which is just a wonderful, wonderful collection, and has diaries, based on diaries of people that were there, and it's very, very detailed in the early part when there were diaries being kept, and then most of the, actually probably more than a year, is in just a small section in the back, because after that it became more and more rigorous, more and more rigorous. Matter of fact, in the middle of the New Life, Mayor Baba said that he had to start sending people back because they were holding, he was trying to, let me talk a little bit about the symbolic nature of this. It appears, and we'll see as I'm going to read some things from Mayor Baba. It appears that, and this is, I hear this from recently listening to a talk by his sister Mani, who went through almost the entire New Life except for the Manonash period, and others who say that it seemed that he was, the idea, the religious narrative is that Mayor Baba received realization at the hands of Babajan, and then was integrated back into the gross physical world and into mastery by Bhasti Maharaj. And so he's already realized, so there's no point in him doing ascetic disciplines and doing all these things. But in the New Life, he said, he wasn't too specific, but the impression is that in order to sort of almost create a template, or to assist others in the future going, achieving realization on their own, which is virtually impossible without a master, he says. But in order to be able to do that, he, as a master, renounced his realization, so renounced his old life state, and went through all the phases that an individual would have to go through in order to become realized through their own efforts. So whether this is sort of factually true in the way that an historian could report it or not, it's important to recognize that many of the people who observed this understood this to be that way, and the narrative is set up in a very meaningful way for people that understanding this symbolism. There's almost like an invisible support system set up just by the fact that Mayor Baba basically says that he has achieved this. So, and we'll get into, he put out some circulars. He was at one time known as, local people called him Circular Baba because he put out so many circulars. But he put out a circular after that particularly started a lot after the New Life period, but he put one out in regard to the Manonash, and I'm going to read lots of that because there's a lot of explanatory and symbolic things here that can help to tease out some of these ideas, I hope. And here we are. So after Manonash, after exactly 2 years of living the New Life and all these things that we've been describing, Mayor Baba entered into what he described as the Manonash, and it appears that the Manonash was really the culmination, the goal that he was trying to achieve as going back, as he says, becoming an ordinary human being with the purpose of achieving this Manonash, which means annihilation of the mind. So this period of the New Life was a 4-month period from October 16th, 1951 to February 1952, and some people say, I think to keep up with that 4-month idea, that it was up to the 16th of February, but that doesn't really, the circular I'm going to read is actually February 12th it's put out, so it's not exact, so I'm not going to swear to a particular date, although they also may have been going on a lunar calendar, which may have been precise, I don't know. In any case, at the end of this period, Mayor Baba issued the first of what came to be called the Life Circulars, and I'm going to read you now some excerpts from the first Life Circular issued on February 6th. Those ends at the 12th. It's the 6th. There's another one that came out on the 12th. 1952, February 6th, 1952. So, and there's some preamble and some other things, and he has a lot of lists and subcategories and things, but this is what I want to talk about. The one all-pervading, all-comprehending, all-powerful God, who is the self of ourselves, and besides whom nothing is real, has helped me and guided me during the Manonash period of my work, and now makes me dictate to you the following. Now, you have to understand also how the people who are devoted to Meher Baba, for them, and he spoke very often, he'd play games or talk with people, and then he'd stop them and say, don't forget I'm God. And he would talk in the first person as if he were Yahweh or whatever your God image is, but he talked as if God. And now all of a sudden, he shifted the narrative in saying that God has helped him. And throughout the new life, there'd be periods where he'd say, okay, we need to do some prayers, and we need to do these sort of ritual things, asking God for God's help for him to achieve this state of the Manonash. And here again, he's saying this, God has helped me, and he makes me, God has made me. And it's interesting, throughout these things I'm going to read, he doesn't say, previously, for example, some people, when he came to the West, people would ask him, do you think this, or you think that? He says, I don't think, I know. Why? Because he's realized. Now he says, well, I feel that I should do this. God made me do this. So this is kind of illustrating this sense that he's an ordinary person now when he's doing this. So he says to try to understand, this is what God is making him write or say, to try to understand with the mind that which the mind can never understand is futile, and to try to express by sounds of language and in form of words the transcendental state of the soul is even more futile. All that can be said, and has been said, and will be said, by those who live and experience that state, is that when the false self is lost, the real self is found. That the birth of the real can only follow the death of the false, and that dying to ourselves, the true death, which ends all dying, is the only way to perpetual life. This means, now we get into a series here of juxtaposed opposites. So, where was I? This means that when the mind, with its satellites, desires, cravings, longings, is completely consumed by the fire of divine love, then the infinite, indestructible, indivisible, eternal self is manifested. This Manonash, the annihilation of the false, limited, miserable, ignorant, destructible I, to be replaced by the real I, the eternal possessor of infinite knowledge, love, power, peace, bliss, and glory in its unchangeable existence. Unless and until ignorant, I'm redacting some of this because it goes on, and it's quite beautiful, but it will take a long time to get through it all. So unless and until ignorance is removed and knowledge is gained, the knowledge whereby the divine life is experienced and lived. This is the little asides here about defining his terms. So he says, unless and until ignorance is removed and knowledge is gained, and by knowledge he means the knowledge whereby the divine life is experienced and lived, everything pertaining to the spiritual seems paradoxical. God, whom we do not see, we say is real, and the world that we do see, we say is false. In experience, what exists for us does not really exist, and what does not exist for us really exists. We must lose ourselves in order to find ourselves. Thus, loss itself is gain. We must die to self to live in God. Thus, death means life. We must become completely void inside to be completely possessed by God. Thus, complete emptiness means absolute fullness. We must become naked of selfhood by possessing nothing, so as to be absorbed in the infinity of God. Thus, nothing means everything. For these last 4 months, now he's getting back to the narrative, For these last 4 months, he's talking about this Manonash period, according to ordinary human standards, and by ways and means known to me, I have tried my utmost for the achievement of Manonash. And he says, according to ordinary human standards. And I can say, in all truth, that I feel satisfied with the work done. This satisfaction is due to the feeling I have of having regained my old life Meher Baba state. Now, his old life Meher Baba state means the state of a realized master. Yet, simultaneously retaining my new life ordinary state. So in the new life, he renounced that and became an ordinary human being. So now he has both. He's both an ordinary human being. So from this point on, in the rest of Meher Baba's life, he's no longer simply, according to this circular, he's no longer simply the God-realized perfect Meher Baba, but he's both that and a completely ordinary human being. So I have regained the knowledge, strength, and greatness that I had in the old life, that's the old Meher Baba state, and retained the ignorance, weaknesses, and humility of the new life. This union of the old and new life states has given birth to life, life that is eternally old and new. Now he's shifting to sort of practical matters. He says, I intend to go in the beginning of April of this year to the west for some months. And as we know, this resulted in his trip to the Mayo Center. This is him with Mara in the garden of the guest house of the Mayo Center. I expect to lead a complicated free life from March 21st, a full free life from July 10th, he's talking about 1952 here, and a fiery free life from November 15th. Oops. So now because this, I'm going to break off now from this particular circular, because this is a very interesting, and people, no doubt people will ponder for a long time over this articulation of a complicated free life, a full free life, and a fiery free life. And because the names given to these various phases of his life and work can easily be understood as being symbolic, and that's what I'm looking for. I want to explore them some more by reading some clarifications that Meher Baba made in Life Circular number 5. Remember, this was Life Circular number 1, so we sent out some other things, most of them having to do with practical matters. And there's a lot of practical matters in Life Circular number 5, but he also says this as a clarification of these 3 lives that he describes here. So, number 1, life today. So he's already said that by these 2, ordinary life and the new life, ordinary life, and the old life, Meher Baba state, coming together becomes life. So he says, life today finds me both strong and weak. The strength is of the conviction of knowledge and the old life Meher Baba state, while the ordinary human state of weaknesses and binding desire, the human state of weaknesses and binding desires makes me feel utterly weak. As already declared by me, I have left to God's decree, and he says this in one of the parts I skipped over. He says that he's completed the Manonash work. He's absolutely satisfied. In other words, it's going to bear fruit of the realization that he was seeking through the new life. But he says that it's going to happen whatever God wishes it to happen. He's not saying that he's achieved it. He says he's done the work, and it's inevitably going to happen when it's God's will to happen. So he says, as already declared by me, I have left to God's decree and sanction the result of the Manonash work for myself and all concerned. And what he says also in these other statements is that according to each one's, I forget exactly how he words it, sort of according to your merit, each one will also, when this Manonash manifests, when it comes to fruition, that each one connected with him and following his orders and et cetera, will, according to their merit, will also receive the result of this Manonash work that he's done. So, he says elsewhere, he gives a whole list of you can follow me and do the be completely literally obedience. You can follow me and just be as obedient you can live near me, he has this whole list of things, and he says, and you can just forget all about me, don't do anything. Because of your connection, you're still going to receive some, according to your merit, you're going to receive some benefit from this Manonash when it manifests, or when it comes to fruition. So that's what he means when he says, and all concerned. Where, how, and when the result of this work will be, I'll leave entirely to the will of God. So this is where he says a little more elaboration on the lives, the free life and the complicated free life, and the full free life and the fiery free life. He says, during my complicated free life, full free life, and fiery free life, I, with the help of those who are ready to do so, will do the work as revealed to me under the guidance of God. So now remember, he said now that he's regained the old life Meher Baba state, and yet he also has this simultaneously this ordinary weak human state. And so he's saying that all these things, I will do the work as revealed to me under the guidance of God. Now this kind of messes with my thesis, which is, and has been, that as he describes it, and after this is, the text that I've been working from is something that he says during the Sahabas of 1955. So this is before that. But he says during that he has, at the hands of Baba Jan and Upasni Maharaj, he became fully realized and fully integrated back into the world, a fully perfect spiritual master. And that he had this visionary experience. My thesis is that he had a visionary experience which was continuous, and he continued to operate in relation to that. Now, and that's why some of the erratic behaviors, all these things, because he was congruent with his overriding continuous visionary experience. Now, in sort of integrated with that, he's saying he will do the work as revealed to me under the guidance of God. So he's both already got this continuous visionary experience where he knows perfectly well what he's going to do, and with that, it's something else, something new as to what he should do next is going to be revealed to him. And so it's almost it's like he's almost more self-conscious about his spontaneous. Adi K. Rani used to say that I would ask Meher Baba, what is this work you do? And he would kind of just wave him off and say, you fool. And then he said, well, I realized that the reason he couldn't give me an explanation was because his work is spontaneous. It's like the waves on the ocean. You can't ask the wave, when is the wave going to rise, when's it going to fall? It's just spontaneous. And so now he never explained that before, but now he's saying, he's actually self-consciously reflecting on his own spontaneity. He's saying, again, if we embrace the narrative, with the help of those who are ready to do so, I will do the work as revealed to me under the guidance of God. So it's almost like he's self-reflecting on this spontaneity. So things become very complex as we get deeper and deeper into these things, which I find great fun to think about. So now, again, he says, I feel, he doesn't say, my complicated free life will be this. He says, I feel, again, it's like self-reflecting on how he, from his realized state, he does things. I feel that in my complicated free life, binding will dominate freedom. In my full free life, freedom will dominate binding. In my fiery free life, both freedom and binding will, by the grace of God, be merged into the divine life. What does this mean? I have no idea. But we're going to reflect on some of these things. But this is what he says. This is, as I say, he's very poetic in a lot of these things. His descriptions of divinity are quite beautiful. But this is the essence of symbolism, is that things that are symbolic are multivalent. They have many meanings. They mean something different for everyone. For some people, they're just nonsense. You talk to people that say, I don't like poetry, it's just stupid. Other people read the same thing and it'll change their life. Well, this is how symbols operate. So this is why I claim that his work is, it may be other things for other people, but it also is, just from an observable level, it's symbolic. And whether or not the symbols resonate depends on the aesthetic. This is part of my thesis also, is that there's an aesthetic to the sacred, there's a beauty. Aesthetics is the study of beauty, and there's certain symbolic statements, certain symbolic things have a beauty to them that attract people. And everyone has to decide whether or not there's enough beauty there to attract them. And of course, the things that really overwhelm you with beauty, you don't decide at all. You just go because you're so attracted. So again, I don't know exactly what Meher Baba means by this, but in the epilogue to his book, Meher Baba's New Life, Balkachuri reflected on these same phases. So this is Bao this is his the book Meher Baba's New Life. It's, as I say, it's a wonderful, detailed reflection on all these different behaviors, and includes lists of Meher Baba bowed down to 5,000 people one day, 4,000 people the next day at the Kumbh Mela in, I think it was the 1950 Kumbh Mela, I'm not sure which one it was. But all these ascetic things that he did, and feeding poor at different times, doing these different things, especially at the Kumbh Mela, they did all, and he had teams of the Monali who were still there with him, helping him round up people for these different projects he was doing. So, concerning, now this is, so that's what was going on during the New Life, which by all accounts was exhausting for him, and for everybody concerned. Now this is the phases after the New Life. And concerning the first phase following the New Life, which he undertook, Baba said, this is Bao talking, I feel that bindings will dominate freedom in my complicated free life. This means, Bao says, that in this phase, Baba took upon himself, to a greater extent, the burden of those closely connected with him. Now remember here that this period that he describes as being the complicated free life, during this period in April 1952, Meher Baba visited the Meher Spiritual Center for the first time. He left early April, sometime mid to early April, he left Bombay, made the long, first time he'd flown to the States. He'd always gone by ship before. And it'd been 15 years, I think, since his last trip to Europe, and longer, since, I think, 18, 19 years since his last trip to, it was 34, 18 years, since his last trip to the United States. This time he's going by airplane. He visited the Meher Spiritual Center in, I think it was April 21st or so he arrived. And then, April 21st. He stayed there for some time, saw some people, but it was mainly a kind of a low-key visit. All the lady Monali were with him, and a few men. They were going to visit Prague, Oklahoma, and some of the men went on ahead. Elizabeth Patterson was driving. Mani and Goher and Mara were in the car. I think that's all. I think Delia de Leon was also in the car with him.
They weren't going to visit Prague. They were on their way to Meher Mount. They just...
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. That's what I meant to say. Yeah, thank you. They were on their way to Meher Mount and the West Coast, but they were going to go to a center that had been established there by Agnes Barron. And on the way, in Prague, Oklahoma, Meher Baba experienced severe injuries during an automobile accident, during which several in his party were also injured. He convalesced at Yupon Dunes in Myrtle Beach, which is very close to here, just north of the city, and until the 6th of August, at which time he departed for New York. So this is what's going on. This is, was he being prophetic? I don't know, but it's certainly, he said that bindings would dominate freedom, and certainly bindings were dominating freedom during that accident and subsequent convalescence. So, concerning the second phase, Baba said, freedom will dominate bindings in my full free life. This is from November 21st, 1952 to July 10th, 1955. Thus, in the full free life, Baba emphasized freedom over bindings, thereby suppressing the bindings. And Bao doesn't actually put that together with specific events, but certainly it was a period of healing and reestablishing his home in Marizod, which he hadn't really spent much time at all. in at all because of the new life and all that. So, now concerning the third phase, Baba said, in my fiery free life, by the grace of God, both the freedom and bindings will merge into the life divine. This means, according to Bao, that the burden of both bindings and freedom that Baba had taken upon himself were consumed in the life divine, leaving the divine life alone in its eternity, indivisibility, and infinity. Now, Baba goes on to say, during his fiery free life, Baba gave darshan to masses of people at various places, and hundreds of thousands, literally hundreds of thousands, were drawn to him like moths toward the light. This was the outer result, Bao is claiming, this is the outer result of his Manonash work and the blending of his old and new life, a work that only the avatar or a perfect master can do, says Bao. So that's one take on exactly what all that meant. Now, so these reflections are from one of Meher Baba's Mandali, Baba Kalchuri. I have no knowledge of whether other members of Meher Baba's Mandali or others agree with these reflections or disagree with them. He published them after most of the Mandali were gone. And I've heard mostly Erich and some of these Mandali, they would reflect on the experiences, but they did not. Erich would always just say, we were his slaves after all. We had no right to question him about anything. So that he never questioned Baba about anything. He would actually be the one to read out these things. He had no idea what Meher Baba was talking about. Well, I mean, he had no doubt he had intuitions and things, but he had no particular idea. So in any event, these reflections give us some idea of the whole, at least one way to understand these symbolic activities. There's, as I say, there's so much going on in the new life that it would be it'd be very time consuming to go into everything. And an interesting thing is that, and he, at one point he does, as I say, he let everybody go because he first started out, he had to train everybody. He went through a training period in Belgaum where just people did simple things. They cooked, they cleaned, they kind of got used to living in very, very different circumstances from what they had been used to. And this was, he had to, that was just the first level of the training, and he gave everybody a certain latitude that you could make mistakes, you could do things wrong, just get used to it, because once, I think it was like, this was started in October, and I think at least certainly by late October or early November, they were getting Belgaum. And he kept saying, okay, by January, I think it was January 1st or January 10th, some date, then we're really on the new life. So he gave about 2.5 months of training period, and then they really did do. I mean, they started out walking, but then he went through various phases of different things, and eventually, the point I'm trying to make is that through all of that, even when they got into the strict new life, he would constantly have to. He felt, because of it, and this is how he articulated it, I'm going to paraphrase what he said, because of my love and compassion for you all, I've slowed down my own progress, because you couldn't take the real intensity that would be required to do this. So little by little, he would send people back, or he'd give them little jobs that would free him up to kind of pursue this asceticism that he felt was required to achieve the Manonash. So, and then by the end, when he came to this 4-month Manonash period, there was only Gustaji and Pendu and Erich and Beidel, I think, were the last 4 who were with him. And then he was able to really apply himself to this final, really strict period. So from any objective standpoint, there is really no rational explanation that I can think of other than that Meher Baba was fulfilling and living in congruence with his own visionary experience, his own subjective sense of realization that he said was continuous, as I mentioned. So to me, though, one of the most striking elements of the new life is the absolute vigor and confidence with which he pursued it. This vigor and confidence mirrors the zeal with which he pursued the must work in the 40s. If you remember the films that we showed in talk I gave a couple weeks ago, he had a particular commitment to, you would think, okay, you know, when we read these things in sort of an abstract way, it's impressive. But when we get to to understanding the actual physical requirements that one had to go through in order to accomplish all this, you realize that there has to be a real commitment, a real confidence, a real sense that what one is doing is absolutely vital to one's ongoing fulfillment of their vision. And that to me is something that doesn't fit into a reductive explanation of what exactly was going on. So that is what I have to say about that period of Mayor Baba's life. There's lots more going on. I'm interested in seeing if anybody has any questions or discussion points. Yes, sir. I somehow knew, Ira, that you would have something
Well,
to say.
the most dramatic incident or story in Mayor Baba's entire incarnation is not well known. It happened during the bloodbath of the partition. At some point during the midst of that, when whole trainloads of Hindus were slaughtering whole trainloads of Muslims, and also Sikhs were involved, Mayor Baba was traveling in that area with a number of men mandali on a train. It so happened that the train was being boarded, as often were, and it's based upon whether the men were circumcised or uncircumcised. They would decide whether to kill them all, because whether they were Hindu, they were uncircumcised, and the Muslims would slaughter them all, man, woman, and child. And if they were Muslims, then the Hindus would kill them all. And the Sikhs also were involved. I think the Sikhs basically took the same side as the Hindus. But I don't know how many Parsis or Zoroastrians were traveling. They heard them coming from a couple of train cars behind, coming toward them. And from the sounds of the screaming, it was obvious they were slaughtering everyone in the cars before them. So Mayor Baba's life and the life of all the Mandali were in grave danger, absolute danger. Mayor Baba quickly said, "Get a sheet and cover me." He pretended to be a corpse. He said, "Just sit around me, hop around me, and act like you're, just reverencing the loss of a dear departed one." He said, "Do it immediately," and they did. And soon after that, the door burst open, and I think it was Muslims actually came in, and instead of asking them to pull their drawers down and see whether or not they were Muslims or whatever, and I think the Zoroastrians do not circumcise, or at least at that point they didn't, but they all would have been killed. But Mayor Baba knew in his omniscient way that these people were very superstitious about the dead and respectful of the dead. So although they would slaughter everyone, man, woman, child, they left all of them alone. And due to Mayor Baba's quick thinking, he saved his own life and the life of all of the men that were with him. It's an utterly remarkable story. I mean, on the level of what's that famous guy, from the movies, like Raiders of the Lost Ark. I mean, it's on that level. Mayor Baba's quick thinking saved his own life. They would have been slaughtered. Baba said they all would have been killed at that point in 47. Now, most people don't even know the story, but it happened.
Yeah.
Did you ever hear it?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, I've read it. Yeah,
Isn't that remarkable?
it's in that New Life book.
Yeah.
It's not told with the same dramatic inflection that you tell it, but it should be.
Yeah, it should be,
It is
yeah.
remarkable. It's just.
Yeah, yeah.
The thing is,
Yeah.
you read these stories and it's like one after another. So they kind
Could you think of a more dramatic moment in Mayor Baba's life? I don't know if it exists. To me, that is the most dramatic one. Life and death, everything was on the line, and Baba's, if Baba was really just stupid, just insane, as a lot of people think about him. He could not function in that pressure so practically to know exactly what had to be doing in the moment. Baba clearly wasn't an ordinary mad person. That story proves it.
I'm right there with you. Yeah. Any other observations, thoughts? Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is the first time I heard what he gave us the class, and what I figured out that Baba was trying to bring people together. It doesn't matter what religion you are in. And brother said that killing and aggression should be eliminated.
Yeah, absolutely.
Within the Ten Commandments.
Mhm.
And the whole thing is we are all, I believe, we are a believer of one God.
Mhm.
and what we need to eliminate our greed in us. That's what is the biggest enemy we have.
I agree. Mayor Bob would make the,
The Mayor Baba eliminated his greed.
yeah, well, he made a tripartite. He said lust, greed, and anger were the three.
Yes.
Babies.
And that's what is the teaching of since God created Adam and Eve. Now,
Mhm.
all the prophets then, that's what they were teaching us. Love, passion, and believe in God and praise Him. Because I've seen several times Mayor Baba has said the grace of God, will of God, all those. So if we sit down together and think about how we can eliminate this greed around the world, what's going on,
Yeah.
that's what where our success is. That's what we
I'd like to mention that incident, it was in the New Life, where Baba said the whole work would have been wiped out.
Right, at the Imampour Mosque.
With
Yeah.
the bird. With the
Yeah, there's a bird. They were in the Imampour Mosque, which is just not. They were in really some of the last days before the Manonash. They were going to start the Manonash. Actually, they were in the Manonash phase, and they were going to go finish the Manonash phase on Tembe Hill, and which he ended up moving that down to be what Erich's room is now. But he started to go to sleep, and there's some noise, and Baba just told Erich, just get that out of here. It's making the racket. And then eventually he clapped his hands just before Erich was going to do that, and said that he had made a mistake. Reminded him of it in the morning. He did a terrible thing. He almost ruined the entire New Life because he was breaking one of these. I forget which one, but one of the not the harmony creature. Yeah. So he and he made them spit on him and slapped them with their sandals. Yeah, and they had to do it, which is what I was saying at the beginning. It's not only a kind of an ascetic discipline like Baba was doing. This is kind of asceticism for him to demand this treatment of him, and at the same time, it's a teaching moment for the Mandalikas. Good God, can you imagine doing that to Mayor Baba? Yeah, that was quite a moment. And Erich would take people there and describe it to him and tell them the story and everything.
It was a nest of birds, a mother bird.
Yeah, as a mother bird with. I don't know if they were already hatched or just
Fledged or whatever, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Well, next time will be on May 16th, Wednesday, 2 weeks from tonight. Robin, you're not going to be here, right?
Right.
But Judy will, and it'll be at 7 p.m. here at the Circle Center. And we're going to talk about, we'll talk about the accidents, both accidents. I kind of gave it a short shrift here. And also the 3 Incredible Weeks and the Madri Mafi announcement that he's Avatar of the Age, which happened in, I think, February of '54, something like that. And anyways, thank you all for coming, and see you next time, I hope.